Hi there. I'm going to be talking for about 5 minutes or so about this book, which has just been published by Repeated Books. And I'm going to sort of explain a bit what I think it's about, and kind of show some pictures. It has pictures. And probably the best way to kind of start with sort of talking about what it is via the cover. So this sort of involved quite a lot of back and forth with the designer about a particular choice of buildings, but we got there in the end. So this is both a kind of juxtaposition of architectural styles and an incredibly cheesy joke about geography. Um, so the two buildings you have here are the Parliament of Canada, which, as you can see, is a sort of Victorian neo-Gothic building. Actually, the tower is somewhat later. The original one burned down, but it's very much in a sort of classic British rather than English, Victorian Gothic style. It could be a kind of town hall in Rochdale. It could be a museum in Oxford, and it points upwards. Above that, you have the one of several government buildings. Let's call it the Parliament for the sake of making it easier, in Wellington in New Zealand, which was designed by the Scottish architect Basil Spence, and is ostensibly in a very different architectural style. It's obviously modernist, sort of arguably brutalist. It's usually nicknamed the Beehive for, again, fairly kind of clear reasons. And the cheesy joke is, of course, that it's upside down because it's in the Antipodes. And these two countries, which these buildings are the parliaments of, Canada and New Zealand, are the main subjects of this book. And the book is it's sort of at a sort of long-term gestation, let's say. The travel on which the book was based was done in 2015 and in 2018. So it's sort of been around in the back of the drawer for a while, let's say. But the thing that kind of made me finally kind of turn the various notes and photos I had on those places into a book was the aftermath of Brexit, and a particular idea that I think kind of came along at that point, or rather also during the campaign, that our natural sort of allies in Britain and kind of economic trading partners were not our immediate neighbours, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Ireland. Our natural neighbours were, in fact, on the other side of the world. They were Australia and New Zealand and Canada. And the reason for this is because they were, in Boris Johnson's words, our kith and kin, as opposed to whatever those people were. They even spoke different languages. So rather than kind of seeing this idea as completely silly, although it is, I thought there was actually kind of something worth taking seriously in this, and you could kind of read the history of these countries in such a way that you could understand certain things about British politics, actually, of the last 20 years, in particular forms of nostalgia. You could, particularly through the strength of the labour movement in those countries, and I guess the kind of the sort of weird kind of connections between sort of British identity rather than English or Scottish, or Welsh identity, British identity, settler colonialism, the labour movement and the trade union movement, and the sort of spirit of 45, which was very much a thing in all of these countries, and architecture. And architecture has a very obvious role in settler colonialism because of the fact that it's the means by which you make a load of countries in the Pacific or in the South Pacific or in North America look like they're in Lancashire or Warwickshire or Surrey, particularly Surrey. So within that, most of the kind of bulk of the book is about kind of buildings and townscapes in places like Melbourne, with this sort of cast iron style, cast iron which was frequently imported from Britain, particularly from Birmingham, The architecture of places like Auckland in New Zealand, which you can see here, you have these kind of sort of 30s modernism with these gigantic steroidal office blocks on top. You have a sort of rather sort of steampunk Victorian arcade style. And at the end of the book, the architecture of parts of Canada. So Montreal with its kind of sort of combination of very sort of high modernism, like the Westmount Square by Mies van der Rohe, and also the architecture of Ottawa, and particularly those Parliament buildings and how they took certain British ideas very, very literally. So, as you can, I think, see fairly obviously here. So this isn't really a certain sort of like lunchtime booze account of the book, and a certain magazine has sort of already described this as in a headline as like, must we hate colonial architecture too? And well, I don't. I think it's all very interesting, in the same way that Stalinist architecture is interesting and fascist architecture is interesting. Not that, we should sort of immediately destroy anything that had the imprint of the British Empire, more that we should recognise that it does have the imprint of the British Empire. And that kind of, that means things, that it retains a particular meaning. It's not something where architecture is this sort of purely abstract thing where, it's just sort of materials and space and so forth. It's very much kind of attached to the idea that it has meanings and political histories, and that those meanings and political histories are interesting. There's also a thing, and just to kind of finish up, I suppose, one of the things that the book sort of implies throughout is that for various reasons, partly to do with Indigenous activism, partly to do with the fact that, after a while these sort of these sort of connections do sort of start to dissolve, each of these countries has sort of had to sort of interrogate itself to a degree, varying degrees of success, but they've all kind of had to sort of confront their imperial history in a way that, and on an institutional level, in a way that actually Britain itself has been much more reluctant to do, particularly with reference to its settler colonies, actually. So that's why, you could have this completely uncritical idea of like, why don't we have a union with, our kith and kin in these countries who are also English speaking, and, they have a good memory of the British Empire, but it was all wonderful. And that's how they ended up there, and no genocide happened to make that possible, no sir. So in a way, there's some things we can, I think, learn from that experience. But generally, it's a book about, the fact that there is, I think, a particular sort of British way of building societies and building cities, which was fundamentally kind of exported, and that export has, had some results which are fairly bleak, some results which are quite interesting, but is nonetheless a project which is fairly disturbing by its very nature. So that's roughly what it's about. I'm making it sound a lot less kind of fun than I hope it is, and that's about all I have to say for the moment. But yeah, it sort of has all sorts of things in it. It has public toilets, it has megastructures, it has a lot about the Gothic, and if you want to see hundreds of photographs by me of these places, knock yourself out. So thank you for listening.